Hi, and welcome to the Lensrentals Podcast, where we talk about images and the people who make them. I'm Roger Cicala, the founder of Lensrentals.com. Hi, I'm Roger Cicala, and welcome to the Lensrentals Podcast. I'm joined in studio today with Joey Miller, the Chief of Technical Support at Lensrentals, and Aaron Close, who runs the repair department. We're going to talk today about how to break your camera. People seem to be paranoid about two things. One is sensor scratches. We clean hundreds of sensors every day, so we're pretty experienced in sensor scratches. The other that I see everybody just lose their mind over is shutter failure. I don't want to buy this camera because shutter's going to fail. Let's talk about both those things first. Sensor scratches, when do they matter?
When they're really big.
Could you be any more specific for those of us who aren't seeing how wide you're holding your fingers apart?
Yeah, I think that typically it's going to take a lot more than people would expect to affect things, because if you're just getting it back from having it cleaned, or you've tried cleaning it yourself and you're a little worried about a mark you've left on the sensor glass, it's very unlikely that that's actually going to affect anything. It's going to take something much deeper in the glass, like you've had some sand or something pitting the glass. Then that's really when you start to see it affect your footage or your photographs.
So scratches are less likely to show up in your image than dust, perhaps.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Would you say that sometimes you can look at the sensor and see a scratch that you could never see in a photograph?
Absolutely.
I think that's a pertinent point, because I've seen people lose their minds, and I'll go, have you taken an F8 picture? Did it show? No, but my sensor scratched. My camera's ruined.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we'll continue to look at as we're going over damage. The idea that people are so paranoid about certain things that they don't necessarily notice or wouldn't have a clue how to test for is a pertinent point, because if you're not going to notice it while you're using the equipment, it shouldn't matter.
Right.
The only thing it really affects is resale value.
And camera body resale value is not like lenses. You tend not to get that much of your money back.
Right. It's kind of like a car. You drive it off the lot, it drops in value immediately.
Yeah, and speaking of resale and used lenses, that's one thing I hear all the time is people just losing their minds, paranoid over this camera's got 50,000 actuations and the shutter's going to fail.
Shutters are going to fail. They're not that expensive of a repair generally.
Yeah, I think that's a critical thing is people think their camera's going to cost $1,000 for a shutter, and it's nowhere near that.
And what is it, like $200-$300?
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. It's not a very expensive part to replace. It's the labor typically that costs so much for that, because you do have to, most of the time, disassemble past the sensor, which will sometimes require some alignment afterwards or not. But it requires a knowledgeable hand and sometimes some proprietary software to fix that. However, if you're looking at a $300 shutter and your camera costs $600, that's a much bigger issue than if your camera costs $5,000. But the shutter's not going to be that different in price usually.
I think that's a key thing. It's an inexpensive used camera, shutter failure is probably going to end up in the trash can. But a reasonably priced or higher priced DSLR, shutter failure is not going to be that big a deal.
And I think like the casual user, they don't need to worry about only having like a 50,000 shot ceiling. Everyday heavy duty professional, oh yeah, you'll blow through that pretty fast. But shutters will last a while.
Yeah, that being said, we've seen shutters last far longer than they're supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're working just fine. It's actually very rare that we see any just simply give out from your regular use.
Yeah. The other thing I've noticed is we do shutter counts on these cameras every so often, and you'll see a camera that has just been used to death, just beaten to hell, obviously has thousands of hours of use, and the shutter count's low, and it's just been videoed for days. So it's not the thing it used to be, I think, where you got a shutter count and that was the end all be all of how much the camera had been used.
Yeah, modern usage trends are making that less and less of a thing.
Well, also there are less shutters involved.
That's a good point too. Yeah. Those are the big things that everybody talks about. There are a lot of things with cameras that people don't think about where the camera's still working, but some of it's not. and we see all kinds of things we pick up where people haven't noticed. Talk about those kind of things that can go wrong.
There's the main issue I find. People think the camera's malfunctioning, and what it really is they haven't dialed in their lenses to work properly with that camera. Autofocus micro adjustment is a real thing. If you've never experienced it, you're lucky. It's not a problem with the camera. It just needs to be calibrated to the lens. But beyond that, if it really is an autofocus accuracy issue, it could be something with the AF module alignment. It could be the mount alignment. Maybe it'll still work. Maybe you'd only see it in certain instances. But
while we're on that topic, autofocus micro adjustment and mirrorless cameras, is it still a thing?
No.
Yeah. I mean, they have it, but do you really have to do it?
But all of those mirrorless cameras are using some sort of hybrid autofocus, phase detection, contrast detection hybrid, which eliminates the need for autofocus micro adjustment because the contrast detection doesn't require it and compensates for any issues with phase detection.
All right. Now, Aaron, I know you and I forever have considered the autofocus module of SLRs to be one of the weak points. A lot of people don't even realize this is a thing.
Sure.
But talk a little bit about what can go on with that.
So, yeah, it's just far more complicated. With a mirrorless camera, you're basically using the same device that's capturing the image for the focusing. It's very simple. With, say, an SLR, you have multiple mirrors involved, various sensors and other optical elements that are taking information and then translating it and communicating it back to the lens. So you have multiple points where something could go wrong. A mirror that is giving you your image for your viewfinder, but also on the back side of that mirror, you have another mirror that's bouncing that same image down through some optical elements to a sensor that then communicates that information back to the lens to make adjustments. There's various hinged points. There's various mirrors that could be misaligned in various ways. Then that can mess up your autofocus system entirely.
I don't remember which camera it was. There used to be a camera that we would fairly frequently get in that it wouldn't autofocus correctly anymore. And we'd lift the mirror up and blow the piece of dust off the autofocus sensor underneath it.
Yeah, you get a very small piece of dust, and that's taking up the majority of that sensor.
Yeah, it's a little tiny sensor.
It's not a very big sensor.
So I think people don't realize how complicated it is. And on the other end of it, you're looking through an optical viewfinder, which is advantageous in a lot of ways, yet that also has to be calibrated to all the other stuff.
Sure. There's a prism that has to be spaced a certain amount away from the actual focusing glass that's capturing the image from the mirror.
For people who've never seen it, when you disassemble a pentaprism, how many shims are there often in place in that little thing?
10?
Yeah, it's really amazing how accurately that has to be shimmed.
Right.
So you can be looking through it and it doesn't look like it's in focus, yet the autofocus is working fine, or vice versa. Looks like it's autofocusing great and it's not. And then the autofocus itself, the little module has to be mechanically calibrated and then also electronically calibrated in most cases. So that's one thing I think people don't realize. Their camera is not quite right, yet it has been damaged. And I don't know if that can happen so much from drops, but we've seen it happen over time with cameras that used to be good. The next part of this accurate picture thing that I think we need to talk about is alignment. Basically, you have a large mount on the camera and a large mount on the lens that click together. They're not very subtle. Those are big pieces in optical terms. And then that lens has to be at perfect right angles to the sensor, not tilted the slightest bit. I've heard 10 microns to 20 microns of edge-to-edge accuracy, which is not a lot. So have you seen that be a problem?
Yes. I think it doesn't really become that apparent unless you're looking very, very closely to the same equipment. In your case, if you own equipment and you're noticing that no matter which of the three lenses you typically shoot with, there's always some softening in one corner or the other, then you might consider that your camera mount or your sensor has come loose from the weight of a lens or something. There are plenty of things that can warp that metal or even crack the housing that it's attached to.
Is that going to be more noticeable on a wide-angle lens?
I would say more noticeable on the wide angles. But then again, it's going to depend on the speed of the lens. If you've got a large enough depth of field, you're not going to see it most likely. It's the extreme cases where you literally see the mount bowing away from the camera body where it's been educational, I think.
I cringe every time I see it, and I can't see it enough, but people running along the sideline at a football game or a soccer match, camera over their shoulder, 7200 2.8 lens dangling from the camera mount. And I don't think we can emphasize enough, the mount's designed to hold the weight of the camera. It is not designed to hold a heavy lens.
Right. If your lens has a mounting ring or a foot, you should assume it's meant to support the weight. It should be your centering element. It shouldn't be the camera body with that hanging off the end of it, or both need to be supported with a rod system.
Yeah, exactly, because that half-pound camera, that mount's designed to hold the half-pound, not the 2-pound lens.
Exactly.
Yeah, and especially front heavy lenses, simple physics, force times lever arm. The farther away it is, the longer that distance, it's applying even more force downward.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it's not even about mounting it either. It's that should clue you in as to how to hold that equipment.
Exactly.
Hold it by the lens.
Yeah. And when you're jogging and bouncing, that weight's even greater. Camera straps can attach to tripod feet, but nobody seems to realize that.
Also, this brings in, especially with mirrorless cameras coming to prominence, that adapters need to be taken into account as well. It's usually the case that you're taking an adapter and mounting a larger lens than that camera was designed for to it.
The bayonet mount is designed to support the weight of the camera, and anything heavier than that shouldn't be supported by the mount. A couple other things that I think are worth mentioning. Aaron, I know you have to do these repairs a lot, but Hotshoes. You see all kinds of things with Hotshoes, I think.
Right. So the Hotshoes, they can get bent. Typically the flash isn't in such good shape afterwards, but you're worried about the camera.
Right. And the camera may be weather resistant, but the Hotshoe's still hanging out in the air.
Exactly. The contacts that are on there are not going to do very well. And typically you're looking at an entire top assembly for the repair. Most manufacturers won't break down the assemblies too far when it comes to photo cameras.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a damaged Hotshoe, typically you're looking at replacing the entire top assembly, which will include any screens, all the buttons.
Usually some circuit boards up there.
Circuit boards for sure. Everything the dials are attached to, the shutter button itself, all those things are built into that one assembly.
I will say, though, in troubleshooting problem Hotshoes, you'll often get false positives just because the Hotshoe is dirty.
Yeah.
So, it's not triggering my flash, or it's only triggering it at full power all the time. Just cleaning it out. Take a brush, blow it out. Even if it doesn't look dirty, there may be some dirt or something in there.
Any particular things you use to clean with when you're talking to somebody? Alcohol or?
Yeah, I'll usually use a little alcohol or that marine cleaner that we use.
Mm-hmm.
And just Purosol and a toothbrush and a little blower. Deoxy is great.
Yeah, deoxy's the strongest because it causes cancer, so it's got hot stuff in it. Yeah. But it's a little toothpick dipped in deoxy is really effective at removing corrosion, though.
Yeah, but once you know your Hotshoe is clean and your corresponding flash shoe is clean and you're still having problems, then you've got issues.
Well, and I think the other thing is to not scream, my Hotshoe's not working because my one flash isn't firing.
Right.
You've got to try something else.
Yeah.
We've had dead Hotshoes come back and it's a week later, the batteries were dead in my flash.
Yeah, that's why when I get things back, I'm always testing it on at least 3 other copies of things.
Yeah, I think that's a real key. The other thing that I think it's kind of card specific, but it happens to some degree everywhere, is failure to communicate with memory cards.
Yeah, big issue. Most common with compact flash because those pins get bent real easy, either from not being perfectly aligned when you insert the card, or the card's got issues with the holes being clogged or messed up in some way, and that'll cause a bent pin, which can cause the card to get even more messed up.
Right.
With SD cards, pieces of the plastic can break off because they're just flimsy little plastic things, or the lock switches can get bumped, or in much rarer cases, the contacts inside the SD slots can get bent.
But it tends to be switches. I think it's important from a repair standpoint, Aaron, the CF card, you bent your pins. Generally, what's your repair going to be?
Typically that they've made that a separate assembly. You can have that entire piece replaced without having to worry with paying for too many other parts. But sometimes it is, especially with the SD card slots, they'll be attached to the main PCB.
The SD tends to be soldered to the PCB. The CF usually is a separate board.
Correct.
So the CF board is a pretty cheap part. The SD card usually going to be a board replacement, right?
I wouldn't say usually. It varies so much, but there's that chance for sure.
Right. Whereas CFast and XQD seem to be pretty fine for the most part.
CF cards tend to be the bad actor in this. You got a ratio of card problems, CF to SD?
Oh, 90% of the card problems are compact flash.
Okay. And it's if you look at those pins, you almost wonder that they don't all bend all the time.
Right. Any kind of, if it's ever a SD card, CFast or XQD card issue, it's almost always a compatibility problem with the card the person's using. It's not an actual problem with the camera.
All right. So we talked about things that can happen. I think in summary, banging the camera around breaks stuff on the outside, but generally doesn't on the inside. Wear and tear breaks stuff on the inside. How do you kill your camera? I want you to go out and your camera's not coming back.
Drop it in the ocean.
Okay.
Take it to Burning Man.
Burning Man.
Let a bear attack it. That's happened.
That's happened. Actually, that camera was okay.
Oh, that's right. The lens was messed up.
The bayonet had to be replaced for something, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But what about sand?
Avoid sand at all costs.
Okay.
That's the easiest way. Everybody likes to tout my favorite, Pentax. And
arguably the
too.
most water resistant of all cameras is the Pentax. Seems to be anyway.
There's videos out there of people taking Pentaxes and Olympuses and even Panasonics and just like dropping a bunch of dirt and sand and water all over them, and then they're working fine. Don't ever do that. Yeah. Just don't do that.
I've not seen any videos of them putting it under saltwater spray.
Never.
Yeah, that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, salt water will instantly destroy everything you've ever loved.
Yeah, Aaron, how much salt water does it take to ruin a camera?
Not much. Just takes a little time.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest things I keep hearing as well. It never got really wet in the salt spray. Salt water in the air being near the beach is enough to corrode a lot of things. I know there are camera repair shops that if they even see corrosion on the outside, won't even open the camera up.
Right. Some, if you have even a corroded screw, just assume that everything beyond that is not going to be economical to repair. Once it gets inside, there's a very good chance that it's corroded some portion of a very large circuit board.
With just a little salt, we've seen it where they come back working. And 10 days, 2 weeks, a month later, you have to open it up and see that over time, that little bit of salt has continued to erode copper tracings.
Exactly. So there's not a very good chance, and this is why service centers will refuse to do that repair. There's not a good chance that the one part they found that was very obviously corroded is the only thing that needed repair. So they may replace what they can see, but maybe they missed something that was just starting somewhere else in the camera. And by the time you've gotten your camera back and you've worked with it a little longer, it starts failing again. Well, that's on the repair shop. They should have seen that to begin with and fixed it for you, right? Well, it's not always that apparent. And so it's this ongoing concern with very little solution other than continuing to repair.
And since most of them give a 6-month warranty with repairs, they're not willing to take the risk because they expect you to be back in 3 months.
That's exactly right.
And it should be said, the same issues with salt are what you would find with alkaline dust from Burning Man and other desert trips. So
it too is a salt. It's just not wet.
Right. Yeah. And it will corrode. That's why don't take anything to Burning Man you don't want to just throw away.
A little salt or, Joey, a little alkali dust, those things get in the camera and erode it. And 800 people out there are going, but my camera's weather resistant. You mentioned earlier, Aaron, that, well, the Hotshoe's out there in the air and not weather resistant in most cases. You can cover it. I think the other part is when we've taken apart weather resistant cameras, we tend to see if there's a weakness, and there's always a weakness, it tends to be the bottom of the camera. Battery door's down there, and it's usually not totally sealed. With a lot of brands, there's not as good weather sealing on the bottom. And I think the engineers designing it are thinking, well, rain comes down from on top. But I've seen people in wet environments take cameras and set them in puddles.
They're setting them in puddles. They're gripping the bottom of the camera with wet hands. They're attaching it to a tripod plate that's maybe collecting moisture and water's pooling underneath as they're using it, and they don't see that. And it's also dripping down into it and just settling there.
No matter how comfortable you are in your weather resistance, and I'll repeat as always, if the weather resistance is so good, how come the warranty doesn't cover water damage? Don't set the camera in wet places.
And, even on a table where you've spilled a drink, there you go.
Yeah, I've seen that a couple of times. We take sticky sugar residue, which is not quite as bad as salt, but it's up there. Me, I'm always a fan of the best weather resistance I've seen is a couple of plastic bags and some rubber bands. But
absolutely, just like with your lenses, you can buy all sorts of crazy expensive weather coverings, but just as effective as a couple of plastic bags and some gaff tape.
Okay, I think it's time to take a break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about actual repairs when you need them. And now, Lens Rentals brings you a meditation moment. Close your eyes. Lean back and listen to my voice. You feel yourself getting sleepy. Relaxed. Drifting on a cloud. You love this podcast. You want to give this podcast a 5-star rating. You want to write a positive review of it and even subscribe to it. You know that will bring you a feeling of joy and contentment. When I count to 3, you will wake up refreshed and go straight to the review page. 1, 2, 3. All the things we've talked about that you can accidentally do to damage your camera, one thing some people are paranoid about is cleaning their sensors. Obviously, that's changed over time, but cleaning sensors is still a way you can damage your camera, some cameras more than others. Joey, you probably clean more sensors than I have.
For DSLRs or anything without stabilization, it's pretty simple. Make sure you're using clean swabs, clean everything. Most of the time, all you need is a blower. So if you have to do a wet cleaning, that's the last resort, really. But the more difficult issue is cleaning mirrorless cameras with stabilizers attached to them.
The in-body stabilizer.
Yeah. A lot of cameras have either a cleaning option that freezes the stabilizer, or I don't necessarily recommend this, but you can just turn the camera on while you clean, and that'll lock it in place. I would use that as a last-ditch effort. I mean, you're not gonna break it by just touching it. You do have to actually touch the sensor with whatever cleaning device you're using. But some gentle movement of the stabilizer isn't a bad thing, but I try to do it as little as possible.
Now, Aaron, you take these apart, so you've seen what the stabilizers actually are. Can you describe a little bit what people could be breaking if they don't do an image stabilized sensor cleaning right?
Sure. I think anybody that's looked at our teardowns, especially of the Sony cameras, can see that it's actually fairly robust framing holding all of that together. However, there's a lot inside that that's not so robust. It is held in place with fairly small springs. Those can come out of place. There's a frame holding that cover glass to the sensor most of the time that's not very strong. That can be moved out of place, cause all sorts of issues. The glass that's in front of the sensor actually is fairly delicate on some of these models. So, for instance, you get into really thin ones like on a Leica camera, and enough pressure, you can definitely crack that glass.
I think the key word then is a gentle touch. If it's an image stabilized camera, at no time should you ever feel like you're putting firm pressure anywhere.
No, and I will say, if you're thinking about buying a mirrorless camera or you own a mirrorless camera, you should definitely at least familiarize yourself with how to clean your sensor, because you're going to have to do it. Either budget to have somebody do it regularly, or learn to do it yourself and don't be afraid of it.
And I think of being aware of those things that you need to disable, such as, if you can, the stabilization, but also keeping in mind what is going to cause the shutter to close over the sensor, so you can avoid that. You don't want that to happen while you've got a tool down in there.
Bad thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So things break sometimes. Most of the people listening have maybe sent a camera to repair, maybe even sent 2 cameras to repair. How many cameras did we send to repair last month?
Oh, I've got 10 on my cart right now that are potentially damaged. I have to test today.
Bottom line is, we're a lot more comfortable with interacting with repair centers about cameras. So let's kind of talk about camera repair in general and compare it to lens repair, since we talked about lenses last time. Camera repairs cheaper, more expensive, about the same?
I want to say that in general, I would say it's going to be less expensive. It doesn't require the same expertise that a lens would. Most of the repairs that are necessary are simply put down into manuals by these manufacturers. You're going in and you're replacing entire assemblies that just need to be plugged in.
I think one cool thing for most of the cameras, they plug it into the computer, and the computer says you need to replace this board, this part. It can diagnose it, which is not possible sometimes with a lens.
Right.
So it gets handed to Joe and they say, replace this board. And that's a more straightforward thing. We talked, I think last time, about depending on what the repair is, we may return 10 to 20% of lens repairs as inadequate. What's it like with cameras?
Far fewer returns. There are definitely issues with symptoms repeating themselves over time, where it's apparent that either the issue that was repaired hadn't been correctly diagnosed to begin with, or was caused by something else that was not addressed.
So it does happen, but less commonly than a lens repair, where we send back a fair amount.
Right. And I would actually say that there are certain service centers or manufacturers where it is a little more common. But
well, let's get into that. We have cameras from a lot of different brands. Who's fast, quick, good? Send them a camera, it comes back great.
typically, we're not going to see any problems out of a Canon.
And we're using Canon factory service.
We're actually using Canon factory service there. There are very few returns.
Yeah. And turnaround time measured in a week or 10 days.
That's right.
So that's fast. I assume you're saying they're number one. Is that right? For repairs.
They're pretty average, actually.
Okay.
That's the thing.
And who else is good like this?
So most you can expect to be pretty good at this for the reasons we've mentioned, where it's a fairly simple procedure. You just have to know how to do it. And you maybe need some proprietary software to accomplish the job, which service center or certified service center is.
So you're saying most of them week to 10 days and done right?
Usually pretty fast unless they have some parts back ordered. But then you'll have some manufacturers where either because of how they've chosen to design that camera, it's more difficult, or they're just not as good at servicing the equipment. I don't know what the answer is there, but you have some manufacturers that we will consistently see issues return after about a month or so of rental.
Okay. So name some names.
Nikon. Yeah.
Now, with Nikon these days, when you send it into the factory, you don't know where it goes. Are we using the factory? Are we using authorized service centers, or what are we doing?
It depends.
Okay.
It depends. And I would say that if I'm going to badmouth somebody, it's going to be Nikon's warranty repair.
Last time I was very active in this a couple of years ago, there were no warranty repairs. Everything was user damage.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, still the same.
They'll find some way to call it impact damage or user damage. And if it is a malfunction of some sort that's electronic, there's an error message that they can't link to impact, that they do cover under warranty, we will very often have that come back up a month, 6 months later. It's the same problem.
Now, one thing that I said earlier, but we know that most Nikon repairs sent to the factory aren't really done at the factory anymore. They're sent out. And we know that most authorized service centers, when they do warranty repairs, get paid a pittance. It's like the entrance fee to be an authorized repair center. Do you think those go hand in hand with the fact that there are very few warranty repairs done?
I think we're guessing.
Okay, we're guessing. Let the record show I think what I think. What about Sony, another big brand? Camera repair is pretty accurate with them, or
yeah, and again, it's if you've seen our teardowns, they're very module designs, and so a lot of the time you're simply going in to find that faulty component and replacing it, and it doesn't require much more than that. Again, you're looking more at labor with any of these,
but they tend to be done quickly and accurately.
Absolutely, Panasonic. There are very few where we see issues come back.
Any that tend to take a long time.
When you're talking about Germany.
And other parts European.
It varies so much. I want to say with Leica in particular that if we have any issues, it's going to take a long time. But that's not always the case. And when it comes to cameras, it's probably less so.
What about our medium format cameras?
Medium format is a question.
And we have less data. We have less.
We do. There are, I think, fewer problems, but because of what they are, they tend to be a little pricier. It's a more expensive camera usually to begin with. So
I know there was a battery door at one point that used to just freak me out. Do you remember what that was? One of the medium format cameras had a battery door that broke, and it was like a $300 repair. They wouldn't sell you a door. You had to.
Was that the old Hasselblad H4?
It may have been the Pentax. I'm trying to remember that first Pentax medium format.
That 645D?
I think that may have been it. I'm not sure.
I mean, that just takes the same LN battery.
Yeah, the one thing I remember is you had to remove the bottom plate, like 6 screws. Then you could swap out the battery door, but it was ridiculously expensive. However, I guess if you're buying medium format cameras, that's not that big a deal. Let's one other thing that we haven't mentioned is occasionally you'll see repair for something that's just a calibration issue. We'll get a camera that the aperture doesn't seem to expose correctly, or those kind of things. I mentally think of that kind of like an optics on a lens, but with cameras, actually, they tend to come back fixed when that happens, the calibration kind of things. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. It's either an adjustment they're making through their software, or, well, let's say if we're looking at a Nikon that has an actual lever built in that moves the aperture lever in the lens, those will frequently get bent and that can obviously cause issues. When we're looking at that, they're not going to do a quick fix of reshaping the lever. They're going to replace the entire assembly. It's accurate because they're simply replacing a part that's going to fit right.
But it's a little more expensive than just a recalibration might be.
Exactly. They're not hooking it up to a machine and punching some buttons. They're actually disassembling the whole camera to replace that part.
A lot of times you can see the bent lever and unbend it, but then you bent and unbent metal, and I worry about strength. And then also you're not sure you're calibrated correctly, because that is the aperture exposure is a calibration with the camera.
Right.
Anything you can think of people can do at home. I was thinking maybe grip covers. Sometimes you can buy those.
Sure, yeah. And actually that's mostly what you can find to buy are going to be the cosmetic elements. To be honest, I can't discourage people when it comes to repairing their own equipment. That's basically how we're here, Roger. This is...
Yeah, we started repairing our own equipment.
I can't do that. It would be dishonest. But I can more genuinely encourage people with cameras, whereas lenses, it's a little more difficult because they're more difficult to diagnose.
Well, and you can optically screw up your lens without realizing it.
So very quickly.
And at home without equipment, you can't fix it.
Right. The whole idea of being able to do a repair is really based on the idea that you understand well enough how to check that you've, one, done the repair properly, but that you didn't screw anything else up in the process. When it comes to a camera, you're really just checking buttons most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the things that you would need to repair simply have to be unplugged, plugged back in. There's not a lot that can go wrong there. You have an order to the process, and if you're a detail-minded person, you could probably do it. You really have to pay attention to little things like screws, because if you put the wrong screw in the wrong place, you can really mess something up, and then it does become a problem.
And I think that's key. Anybody who's watched you do a teardown sees that each screw is set by the part as you disassemble. If I was going to try a repair at home, say my camera's out of warranty and I want to see if I can look inside, I would do that. And, I'd put my cell phone on video mode and video myself, because then I could play it back and go, wait a minute, how did this go when I took it apart?
Absolutely. Take pictures as you go.
Just constantly. Yeah.
Right. You don't want to, and that's the thing. If you forget to plug something in and when you put it back together, a button's not working, then,
You take it apart and plug it in.
Plug it back in.
And even today, I've seen that happen to you and all our repair techs where, oops, this button doesn't work anymore. I forgot to plug the flex in, and it's an extra hour's time, but that's okay.
Yeah. And, it's entirely on you. If you rip a flex while you're in there, guess what?
They're going to charge you.
There's no covering that up. They know you went inside that camera. You'll be charged for tampering if you send it to a service center.
Last time I checked, that's usually like $50 or $100.
Right.
So
it's an inconvenience that just sort of, it hurts.
But if you're talking about an out of warranty item, it may be a consideration.
Sure.
Also, to touch on what you said, if you are detail oriented, if you don't really have any kind of mechanical aptitude for this kind of stuff, don't do it.
That's true.
Don't attempt it. If you're into that kind of stuff, like I did a watch repair apprenticeship, work on my own motorcycle. Like I can do all that stuff because I know I'm inclined to that kind of thing, but I'm not going to go tell somebody who doesn't do anything like that to ever even attempt to touch anything like that.
Right. And I would throw out, if you're going to try to do this on your maybe I can fix it camera, if you've never done little JIS screws before, first get the right screwdrivers, because you've got to have that.
Yes. Japanese industrial standard screwdrivers are very different from Phillips. You will strip out a JIS screw with a Phillips head every time.
Yeah. And if you strip out that screw, you're basically done.
Yeah.
You're at an impasse.
Yeah. You can try drilling out the screw. Good luck with that. So I think that's it. But I was going to say, get some piece of junk electronics and practice taking out screws, because you will strip screws when you start doing this.
All this being said, you really shouldn't start anything unless you have the part to replace. If you don't know what the part is you need to replace, that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have access to the parts, there's really not much point in going inside, because as we've said, most of the time you're simply replacing a component.
And I think the time to go in is, this is my camera. I'm probably not going to pay to have it repaired. I may want to look inside and see if I can see what's there, and maybe I'll just have fun taking it apart. There are a couple things you can't try to do at home. You can't replace a shutter because you need the computer equipment and the programs to reset it. Pretty much the same with aperture. Anything else, there's just no sense even trying. You can't replace a sensor because you can't buy one and you couldn't calibrate it. That's the other thing. But,
Indeed. Good luck with that.
yeah. And I mentioned kind of like when you do and don't repair. Now, obviously, if you're under warranty, you send it in and you take your chance. But I guess the general rule is most of these repairs cost the same on a cheap APS-C camera and a $5,000 Pro camera. Shutter replacement, a board, it's a similar cost. So sometimes the less expensive camera is not really worth sending into repair. Are there any places that are charging cameras? I know in video world it's common, an inspection fee before they will repair their camera.
Some, yes.
Okay.
So Panasonic comes to mind. There'll be a fee to get an estimate.
So,
Basically, their time to diagnose.
So
That's what
they
you're
send it in and they're going to pay $100 even if it's not repairable.
Or if they decide not to repair it, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the only one I can think of. Are any others doing that in cameras? It's really common in video, but I don't see it.
That's the only one that comes to mind.
So in most places, you can send it in and they'll give you a price before they do any work and you can say, never mind. In some lenses, you can't get them repaired no matter what. There's just nothing out there. Any cameras that way?
Maybe some of the compacts.
Yeah, or it's just not economical to do so. But yeah, I think definitely when you're looking at compact cameras.
These are non-interchangeable lens cameras.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. Where basically you have two parts that can be replaced. You have the lens assembly, which includes the sensor most of the time, and then you have the shell with all the buttons inside. And that's basically it. So
if you've had it a year or two, it's not worth sending in.
Right.
I think the one thing I see that is people with, there's dust in my lens on my compact camera. Well, you're all done now, unless it's under warranty.
Get used to that dust.
One thing I want to touch base on when we're talking about deciding whether to send your camera in or not, is it worth it or not? There's some things that you might make the decision, especially with an older used camera. Am I going to just keep this like it is? And the big thing I think of is I/O ports. Very commonly, you'll find a camera that, somebody's jerked a cable and now the HDMI port's pulled and no longer working. My thought is live with it. And if you send it in under warranty, they're going to deny it because they're going to call it abuse. And for almost all of those kind of things, they have to replace the main board, which is expensive. Anything else that you can just go, okay, you might want to live with not having a mic port or HDMI port or what else?
Sometimes you'll get some dust or something that's very deep inside a viewfinder, and it may be somewhat aggravating while you're trying to use the camera, but in some cases they're going to need to replace quite a bit to access that. They're not going to get the dust out in some instances.
That's in the viewfinder, not in your pictures.
Right, exactly, exactly. So if you see it while you're using the camera, it's not showing up in your images, it may not be worth sending in because they may just opt to replace an entire prism or do something that...
Even the tire top assembly sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
On that, though, in a lot of DSLRs, it usually isn't up in the prism. Sometimes it's just right on the focusing screen, which often can be replaced pretty cheaply.
Very easily in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And from some brands, you can buy a replacement focusing screen.
Yeah, like $30.
Yeah, it's not
yeah,
bad.
And that's an easy swap out for sure. Just have to get the right model because they're all slightly different shapes.
That's exactly true.
But I would even go so far, if you've got a scratch on your mirror, if it's an SLR, it's not something that affects your images. And that's how you should think of these things is, does this really affect my use and my end product? If not...
Or is it just triggering my OCD?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And affecting resale value. If you're still...
Well, I think we're talking about, when we're talking about cameras not worth repairing, I think resale value is probably pretty low anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, if it's your, 1DX, you're probably sending it in.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that kind of covers things, but any last thoughts, or each of you give me a last thought or two of take-home message from today?
Mostly just, take good care of your gear. Keep it in a padded case. Keep it out of water. Keep it out of sand.
Wipe it down on a regular basis.
Yeah.
If you let dust and things build up, then that inevitably will make its way into dials and buttons, and it'll gum things up. And it's just, it's easily avoidable if you just keep an eye on things and take care of it.
I think I said this in the lens episode. It's like having a car. You take your car in for regular maintenance. Do the same thing with your camera.
You send it in for regular maintenance?
Well, do regular maintenance on it.
Joey, do you keep silica packs in your camera bag or not?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aaron?
Yeah, absolutely.
Me too. And we live in a fairly moist climate down here. So.
Yeah. And you can always buy like large things of desiccant at like Target or Walmart.
Right.
And it's like $10.
And you can reuse it. People don't know. You put it in the oven on 100 degrees for a couple hours and it's ready to go again. Mm-hmm. I think the one thing that I'd leave people with is that there are calibrated things in SLRs particularly that can be a little off. And when cameras are a little off, people sometimes don't think about the fact that it may need to go be calibrated.
What was it? Arthur C. Clarke said any technology sufficiently advanced is basically magic.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
Just because you don't understand how it works doesn't mean it's not complicated.
I think we talked about everything I can think of. Aaron, you have any last thoughts?
I don't think so.
I think we'll call that a day today. We've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed it a lot. This is kind of fun to talk about, kind of flashbacks to my repair days.
It's always a good time.
So we'll call it a day. Thank you for listening to Lens Rentals Podcast. Thanks for listening to the Lens Rentals Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, let us know at podcast@lensrentals.com. I'll leave you with this quote from Bob Ross. We don't make mistakes, just happy little accidents.